hoping to talk a little bit about the changes to education surrounding Common Core, but to offer a perspective that I think might be helpful to us in our conversations about how Common Core fits in the context of the whole broader education reform movement here in Utah and across the country. I took the title of my presentation, The Cradle to Career Education Agenda, from, it was a speech given by our Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, in 2010. And he was discussing all of their key education goals of the Obama administration, and he called them their, quote, Cradle to Career Education Agenda. Then he goes on to say that America is in the midst of a quiet revolution in school reform. When he gave this speech, it was in front of UNESCO, and it was about 18 months after a majority of the governors had signed on to participate in an initiative to adopt common standards for math and English language arts, and that they have yet to be written at that point. But judging by the number of people in our country who still don't know what Common Core is almost 4 years after it was initiated, I think he was right about the quiet part. As for the term revolution, that's not usually a term we use for incremental change, is it? And so I want to go over a little bit by what I think he meant by that. Was he just speaking ambitiously, or does the policy match that characterization? We hear really similar talking points, the Cradle to Career Education Agenda here locally. Perhaps you've heard the commercials on KSL about Prosperity 2020, or seen some of their literature that they give out. When Prosperity 2020 was announced, KSL interviewed a number of the community and business leaders behind this program. And here's just a couple of the quotes I pulled out on Governor Herbert's website. It says, "We need to do this to align educational training to the workforce demands of the marketplace." And Deborah Bale, she's the president and CEO of United Way. And she said, "It requires everybody working together on the same issues, the same goals, in order to have that pipeline from cradle to career." In the first couple of months of Obama's presidency, Congress passed an unprecedented stimulus package. This bill included $100 billion for education. Major newspapers buzzed about the unprecedented power that was given to this one education secretary, and they speculated about what he would do with it or what could be accomplished with that money. But he'd only been in office for a few months. How would he spend that money? Luckily, or coincidentally, I don't know, during that same time, some of the most prominent names in education reform got together in a meeting in Washington, D.C., and the product of that meeting was this document called Smart Options, Investing the Recovery Funds for Student Success. And they outlined their key recommendations for how this stimulus money be spent. And inside it has this list of participants. I know that you can't see all of them, but there's a number of representatives for the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation, the Fordham Foundation, David Coleman from Student Achievement Partners, that he is now known as the chief architect of the Common Core standards. Michelle Reed, she was kind of made famous by a movie, Waiting for Superman, and was later made even more famous by a testing scandal in her school district, where they changed test scores to make certain schools look better and people look better. Anyway, all of these reformers got together, and the Secretary Duncan, or the Obama administration, must have really liked their ideas, because they have become the basis, or at least they're fairly identical to the administration's policies that have become part of all of their programs ever since. So the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, they are two trade organizations in Washington, D.C. that hold conferences for governors and state education leaders to advise them of the latest research and recommendations as promoted or recommended by some of these very same reformers that we just listed on that other page. So they had already been working with the National Governors Association for a number of years on a standards-based project called the American Diploma Project. And they had pilot programs, they had standards for a few subjects, they were working with different states, and like I said, it had gone on for a number of years. But somehow, between the reformers, the Obama administration, and a handful of governors collaborating through the NGA, it was agreed that the stimulus money would be used to accelerate the push for common standards and assessments by incentivizing the states to commit to the idea of adopting an all-new set of standards that would have to be hastily written. This effectively shifted the momentum from a single subject, multi-year, pilot-tested approach that had been in process with the NGA to one where they wrote all new standards for math and English language arts for all of the grades, kindergarten through 12th grade, and they did it in less than a year with limited feedback and no pilot studies. How did Utah's leaders respond? Really quick, I just wanted to point out the difference. I don't have time to go into great detail, but we hear a lot that this was state-led, and I just want to point out the difference of what we consider typically a state-led process, or even a legitimate federally led process to look like. On the left, 3 branches of government, our school board is acting under the jurisdiction of our state constitutions, and then on the right, that's the government's process for Common Core that I just explained, where the National Governors Association was kind of the middleman, or there was kind of a broker between these private reformers' interests, the goals of the federal government with the stimulus money, and then a few of our state executives, mostly the governors, who, by the way, this is a trade organization. We don't elect our governors to go and represent us on the national stage. It's different. I think best practices are different, typically. So anyway, this is what was going on in our Utah State School Board meeting minutes around that same time, those same months. So in April of 2009, we hear, all of this is coming to some kind of peak moment when it relates to the U.S. Department's goals for the stimulus money. There's a great momentum behind national common standards. I would say it's the expectation of the Secretary, Arne Duncan, that we move into that environment in the next 2 or 3 years. And then the next month, the reason this has become more on the front burner is because the NGA and CCSSO have received some funding to go ahead and start developing Common Core. They're all willing to do this for free, but only if we sign by Monday. No pressure there. So the governors were officially presented at their spring Chicago meeting of April of 2009. They were officially presented with the Common Core State Standards Initiative, and they were given 2 weeks to sign a memorandum of understanding that they would participate in this effort, and this is the school board discussing if they're going to participate in this effort or not. And of course we know that it was Governor Huntsman at the time and Superintendent Harrington on behalf of the state school board did agree for Utah to participate in that program. In the same speech that I mentioned at the beginning, Arne Duncan goes on to say, today, 37 states in the District of Columbia, there's more than 37 now, have already chosen to adopt the new state-crafted Common Core standards in math and English, not studying it, not thinking about it, not issuing a white paper. They have actually done it. Is that what he means by a quiet revolution? So even when I talk to people and they concede that this process isn't your typical process of how we do things constitutionally, either at the state level or the federal level, they say, well, it's just standards. We can do a lot of things with them. It's just standards. It's a good thing to have standards that are the same for everybody. And so we want higher standards, that's all it is, right? My main purpose tonight is to hopefully have everybody have a little bit bigger, take a little bit different perspective of this. So these stimulus-driven education reforms, the Common Core State Standards is just one part of it. Stimulus money was offered to the states in a number of different ways. The biggest amount was through our State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. The second was through a series of grant competitions called Race to the Top that are still ongoing. We applied as a state twice and didn't win those funds, but we have districts within Utah that are applying directly for funds during Race to the Top. They have, there was a Race to the Top for assessments, and they just announced a Race to the Top for early childhood education and intervention. So these programs coming from the stimulus money are ongoing in that way, but Utah did get the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, and I'm just going to leave that to Chahel to go into a little bit more detail. For the states that didn't win grant money, like Utah, the Department of Education offered states waivers from some of the conditions of No Child Left Behind. And there was authority when they passed No Child Left Behind for the Department of Education to give waivers from certain conditions. What it didn't allow them to do was to add new conditions in exchange for getting rid of some of the other conditions. But in order for Utah to get a waiver, we had to agree to these new conditions. And the interesting thing is, between the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, the Race to the Top grant competitions, the ESEA, or the No Child Left Behind waivers, there are 4 conditions that are the same between all of them. And they just happen to be some of the same things that those reformers recommended in that document. They are called the 4 assurances. If you just even go to Google and type in the 4 assurances, then everybody knows what these 4 things are. So the first, like I said, was common standards and common assessments. The second one, and they're talked about in different order, there's no particular order here, but the second one is improving teacher effectiveness. And like equitable distribution of qualified teachers, teacher accountability measures. In Utah, that includes time teachers pay to test scores. And it's interesting when I talk to the teachers in my kids' school or to our administrators, this is something that the teachers are not really happy with. That's causing some disruption between that they work and collaborate together. But none of them have made the connection with Common Core, this larger education stimulus package yet. And the only thing I want to really say about this at this point is that there are a lot of studies, a lot of research has been done about time teachers pay to test scores or the ineffectiveness of that. So much so that there's actually something called Campbell's Law that specifically has to do with the misapplication of test scores. And it says, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. In other words, instead of tests being a measure of how well teachers teach, this misapplication of test scores end up changing the way teachers teach to the test. The third assurance was identifying and improving low-performing schools, school grading, that type of thing. And I think Jaquel will probably touch a little bit more on this. As it's playing out in some parts of the country already, we can look around to other states and see, kind of get an idea of what's coming our way. And different states are choosing to handle it in different ways, but there's been a lot of school closures and a push towards more charter schools, and which effectively gives tax dollars to the charter school companies who then function without the elected representative of local boards or things like that. And they call it school choice. But contrary to the popular perception that this will provide families with more options and opportunities, it is the schools that are choosing which students they will and will not accept. And families can either go along with the policy of the charter or go elsewhere. There's an interesting case in Texas where a girl who worked really hard to get into a special charter school for STEM topics was told that if she wouldn't wear a radio frequency ID badge that she could not attend that school, that she could go get her education elsewhere. So, something to think about. And the fourth assurance is pre-K to college and career data systems, or the state longitudinal data systems. And some states, Utah was one of them, had already started from a previous grant program to create state longitudinal data systems. But in order to get the stimulus money, you had to meet a certain number of qualifications. And Utah not only met those qualifications, they went the extra mile and did some extra ones. But here's what the Secretary of Education says about data collection. He says, we have to be transparent about our data. We have to raise the bar so that every child knows on every step of their educational trajectory what they're going to do. I don't know if that gives anyone else chills. Maybe I'm just a weirdo, but pipeline of pint-sized human capital. That's what we're talking about here. And this is a little tongue-in-cheek. Sorry, I was doing it late at night, so it might come across too sarcastic. I apologize, but I just said, are we ready to replace life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness with lifelong tracking, conformity, and the pursuit of whatever occupation best matches your data profile? I'm not ready for that. I just want to spend a little more time on the data governance issues. Already there's a number of bill files filed in Utah by legislators. Last legislative session, I was trying to follow and learn more about what controls there were for the data, and there weren't a lot. And if there were some, they were spread around in different bills, kind of piecemeal. And I wrote a man named Joel Reidenberg. He's the professor that chairs the Center for Law and Information Policy at the Fordham University, not the Fordham think tank, Fordham University. And they've done some studies about student data privacy. There's a big long white paper that you can read, it's like 40 pages long, where they went and compared what types of data the states were collecting. And I said, it appears to me that we're moving away from student privacy and away from parental consent. And he wrote back and said, you're right, that's the trend that we're seeing too. So we've gone and spoken to some of our legislators and discussed this a little bit, we're gonna be working on this, I guess, during this next legislative session, but I think as parents we need to be really alert, because the forces pushing for the data to be more open, less private, and to not let the parents know exactly what's going on because it's too much of a pain to get their permission type of thing. They're pretty well organized, and they don't want the same things I want for my kids. Anyway, but some of the issues that we talk about, the problems people mention, well, with all the student data in one place, doesn't that expose student data a little bit more to hacking or misuse of that data, just getting the data without any kind of authority or approved access? Next one is that the collection and access to data without parental consent, as previously required by the FERPA law. So one of the things that Arnie Duncan has done in his tenure is the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act. They went and made some regulatory changes to that law. Congress passed the law, but they didn't go through Congress to change the law. They just changed some of the wording, changed some of the definitions, but it has significantly changed the effect of that law. Primarily that we can now take data that was limited to be collected only in your child's immediate school, and we're collecting that in a statewide longitudinal database, and it changes some of the access for other groups such as federal or what they call stakeholders, which could mean a technology company that's working with your school or things like that. Interoperability, that was one of the keys of all of the grants, even the ones that preceded the Common Core State Standards Initiative, that we had to create the databases in a way that they were interoperable with other states' databases, and not just other states' databases, but other databases within the government, health and human resources, and that type of thing. So these databases were designed to be interoperable. That's one of the things that Professor Reidenberg talks about in his report, if you want to get into the details of that. And then there's these for-profit products and services based on student-level data without transparency or accountability to parents or students. Maybe some of you have heard about In Bloom. It was kind of a big deal in the news a little while ago, but In Bloom is a company of Bill Gates, the major funder of Common Core state standards, and it is InBloom is some software that they've developed. They can take all the student data and kind of put a face on it. Right now, our student data in Utah is kind of in what they call, it doesn't have a customer-facing view. If you want to get data in or out of it, you kind of have to be a programmer type of person and make queries and get reports. And but InBloom is a full software where you can sit down and just like you would, look through the internet, you would look through this this data that's now, if it goes into InBloom, stored in a cloud type of data structure. And they started with 7 states partnering with them. Utah was not one of them, but the way that parents found out about it is a reporter went to a technology conference and he was getting a little demonstration of InBloom, and they pulled it up, isn't this neat? And they were going through records and records and records of students' social security numbers, personal descriptions of what they look like, and all sorts of information that had been collected on them through the schools. And now this private company has that and wants to sell that back to states or use it in different ways. So they have the technology, but they need the data that can only be collected through the states. And they could only do this because, once again, the data that had been previously protected by the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act can now be shared. And if they consider them a worthy stakeholder, and I guess InBloom was. But the parents who read that news article, who discovered that their state had given their students' information away, were not really happy about that. The third issue with data is we call a lifelong data profile, especially as we're starting these preschool, state-funded preschool programs. A requirement of all the ones that I've seen suggested, they get the data or the information about the kids, and that goes right into this state longitudinal data system. And so we're building up kind of a dossier of people that starts when they're in preschool. It goes all the way through 12th grade. In 12th grade, our UTREX data manual says when they get to 12th grade, we're going to put their social security number, or if they go to a trade school or something earlier, then we enter in their social security number, and then we track them into the workforce. And so we're calling it a student longitudinal database, but there's no rule saying at some point this data is going to be erased, or, I mean, there are no governance laws right now in Utah for how long this data can be stored or any of those types of things. So we're creating this data profile of people, and parents like me have concerns, well, how will that be used? 12 years from now, when my daughter's leaving school or trying to get into college or getting a job or whatever, how important will this learning profile be that will follow these students into their adult lives, or will it have negative impact on their future? Will we look at people in terms of data instead of things that we don't or can't collect or assess electronically? Anyway, the last one is the public-private partnerships that are being formed to make human capital decisions. For example, last week, the National U.S. Chamber of Commerce met on one day, and the next day, the Business Roundtable met. And cleaning my house, I had it streaming over line. I was listening. I have to admit, I got a little sick to my stomach. Listening to these businessmen talk about how thrilled they are about the access to data that they're going to have, and how they imagine using that to help recruit and prepare students for their various industries. And that thought has been around so long, I guess, that people don't flinch. But when I think about it in terms of my own kids, maybe I have a little bit different emotional reaction. So like I said, it's been around. The idea of workforce types of goals for education has been around for a long time. This is a book called Career Education, a Priority of the Chief State School Officers. So remember the CCSSO that has been instrumental in this whole creating the Common Core standards and the data models and stuff like that. This book was published in 1976. I was 3 years old in 1976. So it's been around a long time. And the very end of this book, they say something that's kind of key. The very last paragraph of the book says, perhaps the key role in evaluation efforts that can be assumed by the state education agency, our state school board or Utah State Office of Education, insofar as career education is concerned, is in the collection, assimilation, analysis, and dissemination of data. Is that the most important role of the state school board to you?
Nope.
And I don't think it is to our state school board either. They passed a resolution recently sharing, kind of expressing publicly some of their concerns about the data. I think we have some common ground here. Again, if we can all look at this reform as a whole package instead of just saying, oh, just the standards and they're good and all this other stuff is different, I think that we'll find more common ground and find better solutions for our children here in Utah. And I'm hopeful that we can do that. This career education, cradle to career type of plan, workforce training has been around for so long. Why hasn't it been realized in a better way? Like I said, it's been kind of incremental up to this point. I have my whole iPad filled with white papers now that I've read from the Council of Chief State School Officers over the years. One of them is called Alternatives for a National Database of Children, of students from K through 12 children. And it talks about, it says there's two ways we can go about getting this national database that we want. One, we can try to go through the federal government and just change the laws, but that's going to be a mess and everyone's going to push back against that. Or the other way is all the states can create their own databases, and then we'll have them voluntarily link them and share them. And anyway, years later, now we know which direction we went. Another white paper talks about, they talk about technology, the technology that we have today in terms of data, the cost of data and storing immense amounts of data and searching through that quickly is significantly different than it has been in past decades. The comparability of data was a key obstacle that comes up here and there. So with all of the states having all different standards and doing different tests, it's a little bit trickier to compare students across the states. And researchers and people who are studying policy, they wanted to get to a point where it was just easier to compare students across the whole country, not only in terms of their test scores, but in terms of their income, in terms of their family structure, what kinds of things impact what we're doing in our education system. So that having common standards is more important to the data than it is to, I think, having good standards. There's laws that prevent a national database, but like I said, we're very creative in getting around things like that these days. And the last obstacle is the one that I am counting on people like you, other parents, to help it remain an obstacle. And that is that the acceptance that we as people have that this is the proper role of government. The idea of human capital versus human beings. We are not programming machines. We are teaching children. We are not producing functionaries factory-like. We are to be forming the minds and hearts of men and women to be human beings, honoring what is good and right and cherishing what is beautiful. This is Anthony Esselin, a professor of Renaissance and English literature in Providence College in Rhode Island. He's written a number of things about the Common Core standards that I highly recommend, just because I love how he writes. His words are beautiful. But they're important ideas to be considering. I think there was a time in this country when free people would have recoiled at the idea of a government aligning people to the workforce or to calling their children in school a pipeline of human capital. And have our sentiments really changed that much? Or are we just not really aware of what is going on? To me, all of these workforce goals seem to imply that the highest aim of education is work. But historically, the purpose of American education was to nurture the development of self-governing citizens with work being incidental to that development. Our founding fathers and other great thinkers were who they were because they studied the great works, not work itself. This nation has uniquely thrived according to the principle that a free market with good people pursuing their own dreams works better than attempts at planned markets with efficiently trained workers. We don't need to march in lockstep with other states on standards to have excellent standards. There were a number of states that had higher standards than Common Core. If this was really about higher standards, we would have maybe followed a different path, I think, and there's nothing preventing us from raising the standards that we see as we see fit in Utah. In fact, the revised math standards that were just revised in 2007 were ranked with an A grade, just as high as Common Core. Was it higher?
It was A-, but they said it was clearer and easier to understand.
Clearer and easier to understand.
They were the same grade.
They both had the same grade, Common Core math. Why are we're not getting higher standards? And the Fordham said there's actually things about your pre-existing math standards that were better. So are we really shooting for higher standards here, or is it more important for this other initiative that I talked about that would be common with other states? And anyway, Jaquel is going to talk a little bit more about some of these things. So common standards and data, sorry, this got messed up, but common standards and data weren't designed for children. Children, I have 4. They're all different. They all learn differently, they move at different paces, and sometimes they're moving quickly and sometimes they take a little longer on certain things. Children don't move in lockstep. That's not a realistic view of human nature and who we really are, I don't think. Common standards are not for children, they're for data. And because that means we have a larger data set, we have the ability to have more statistically significant trends on which we can base policy. And then we have what we hear called data-based decision-making, or I like to call it centralized reform replacing local control. People making decisions about broad data trends instead of parents, teachers, administrators, making decisions about our schools, our communities, our needs. Anyway, so like I said, Jaquel is going to go into that a little bit more, but before I turn it over to her, I just want to end with a personal thought. I've never been intensely involved in politics. I mean, I go to my caucus meetings, I vote, I'm aware, but I've never been this involved in political things before. And I'm genuinely troubled by the divisiveness that I've encountered in talking to other people around the state about this, the Facebook conversations that can get kind of heated in the chat room conversations. And the reason it troubles me because I believe in our communities, in our state, that we generally share the same values regarding local control, the importance of family, and the primary stewardship of parents to direct the education and nurture of their children. I think that the problem that's causing the divisiveness is that we're just looking at it from different perspectives. Some people we just want to talk about the standards, and some of us want to see how adopting new standards affect the whole picture of education reform. So I'm hoping that as we move forward that we have these conversations. We need to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the standards, but I'm hoping that we can do that in terms of this broader context that I've showed. And it's not just a personal value or a community value. I just wanted to point out that according to our Utah Constitution, the state's role is secondary and supportive to the primary role of parent. That is our law. If we are going to navigate safely through this education reform, we need to be aware of the dangers that are less visible than the ones that we are talking about right now. So I I've sacrificed a lot of my own time and money, as well as other mothers and parents that I know that have become really active in talking about this around the state. But I'm motivated by one thing. This is my little baby. I just think probably every parent has had that profound experience of looking at your sleeping baby's face and just being struck with awe and wonder, the great responsibility of that stewardship. And that's what motivates me. Who will determine his future? Will he live in a world where he's free to make his own choices without any hindrances? Or will outside forces have a little bit more influence than they have in the past? So thinking of our sweet babies in their cradles, I just want to close with this poem that I think summarizes what's really at stake here. Infancy's the tender fountain, power may with beauty flow. Mothers burst to guide the streamlets from them souls unresting grow. Grow on, for the good or evil. Sunshine streamed or evil hurled, for the hand that rocks the cradle is the hand that rules the world.